This week we are focusing on detail and how to selectively add detail to our sketches. So I'd like for us to first take a look at page 72 and 73 out of our freehand sketching book. These pages really show how to step by step start with a sketch and then slowly layer on detail in intervals as we go through the process. Notice on this first sketch, there's very little detail. All that's shown here are overall contour lines. And what I mean by overall is you're trying to get the form, the whole form of the building that you're trying to show on your composition. So notice how it fills the entire space. And think about what you notice first about a building. You notice the shape of the building. You notice the roof, maybe the openings, the structure. So that's what's starting to be outlined here. You've got a roof, a column, an opening, the ground line, and that's about it. And then from there, you can layer on another level of detail. But this is, we're still not showing every single tile line. You don't see the brickwork or anything like that. You're looking for the intermediate lines. What do you notice second? You notice that on the tiles you've got some hills and valleys on the roof. So you start to draw in the dividing lines of that information. You've got the ending points of some of the structure. You start to layer that in. Some of the mullions and details of the windows and the columns. But then finally, it's not until the third step that you start adding in the detail of every single tile, of every single brick. But you still don't have to fill in all of it. You hint at what's there. So you think about what is the essence of the building and what information do I need to show to capture that? What absolutely cannot be left out to tell the story of this building, and that's what you're trying to work towards. And then finally on this page we see how to add shading and shadow. You still see detail even through the shading and shadow, so you want to work on how these two can interplay and how one influences the other. Now remember, back at this first step, you can use your really light line weights, your 005, to create the structure. And that way, if you make any sort of mistake, it's easy to correct it with the second line. And then what I like to do is go back over my outlines with a heavier line weight. This especially works well if you're creating perspectives and you have a lot of those converging construction lines to get to that vanishing point. They'll essentially start to disappear as you layer on all of this information. So remember, you're working from overall to those smaller items such as texture and material. This is the sketch that I set up last week. I started with really light construction lines and I drew my 2-point perspective, just getting the overall shape of the building. And then I added columns, started adding the windows, an outline of the vegetation, and I'm hinting at some of the detail, but I'm going to show you how I would add detail in ink. Now with ink, you really want to set up a hierarchy where your outlines and your important structural elements are the heavier line weight, as well as things that are closest to you, just like the line weight exercise that we did last week. But then when it comes to secondary things that maybe you don't see right away until you really start to study and examine the building, such as some of the indentations and the stonework, maybe even smaller windows, things like that, you will use a lighter line weight, the fluting in the column. So that's why I outlined everything with the heavier line weight, and now I'm going to come through and add selectively some detail that I think is important. And you'll notice too, on each side of the sheet, I'm sort of fading out the detail. Even my heavier lines stop short. So I'm letting the sketch fade towards the edge of the page. So that's another strategy that you can focus your detail and even your color in a certain part of your sketch. So I'm going to get started adding this detail. Notice how I selectively added material detail and then I used really light line weights, so the form and structure of the building is still the first thing that you see, much like walking up to a real building, and that's what you notice first. And then you have to look harder to see the detail lines, and my eye can start to fill in some of the details so it's not overwhelmed with detail. So now that I've got the ink finished, next I'm going to move to watercolor. And I'm going to add several layers of watercolor, starting with basic washes to get the colors that I want and start adding in the shadowing. And you'll notice that I'll skip around because I'm trying to complete a portion in watercolor, let that dry while I work on a separate area so that they don't start to bleed together. So you can be strategic about the parts that you work on. And I'm going to try to maximize the layers that I use so that I don't have to use more than 3, because we want this to be quick, right? If you're working on site, you can just add a splash of color to indicate shading and shadow and then color matching. And then you can enhance some of the textures by using those layers, just like I showed you last week for the texture swatches.